Well, hello and welcome everybody. I think it's the first live conference event in 2019. No, we did one earlier in Warwick, but that's the first big one we've done. Hi, Melinda. Can you all see behind the column? Is that okay? Yeah, stand here. Well, no, hello and welcome everybody. It's actually a real pleasure to see so many people here today. I'm just going to do some very quick housekeeping and a couple of apologies. As far as we know, there is no alarm. Actually, we haven't checked, but I don't think there's an alarm today. The Wi-Fi is
BTU open.
I'm the least technical person in the room actually knows what the Wi-Fi is. So BCU open, so it's just open access Wi-Fi. Toilets are through the door and back on yourself on the right. And we have got a couple of things we're doing. We're live streaming, so Jordan and Gustavo are live streaming. And if you want to share that, that's the Creative Alliance Facebook page. We're live streaming at the moment, so hello to everyone that's watching. And we also have Rachel Tipping and Gamal Nawain, who are interpreting as well. We've got some changes today at today's format. Unfortunately, as happens with live events at the moment, Helga, if you're watching, if you can also be best wishes to Helga, who's not very well. So we're going to have to change some of the format because it was going to be in conversation with Sandeep and Justine, who are now in conversation with each other, and who managed to turn this around at literally the last minute. So thank you very much. Also, best wishes to Muna Ahmed, who is poorly, and thanks to Jake Jarvis, the Associate Artist, for stepping in at such short notice. Also, thank you to Victoria, if she's here, for, thank you for basically the registration person that had to do all of the work, and literally with 10 minutes notice, so thank you very much for doing that. I think that's all of the thank yous and apologies we need. So I'm going to pass over to Karen, Dr. Karen Patel, who's going to explain why you're all here, other than the sandwiches.
So hi everyone, I'm Karen. I'm the director of CEDIA, which is the Centre for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in the Arts at Birmingham City University. We're in the Faculty of Arts, Design and Media, and this event has come out of many conversations we've had within CEDIA about inequalities in the creative sector, and Laura and Noel have co-organised this event, and it's really great to see you all here, so thank you all for coming. We've also got a CEDIA celebration event afterwards where you can learn a little bit more about CEDIA, what we do, and meet some of our advisory group members who are here as well, because CEDIA was launched in 2021, but it was online, so this is our first in-person event. So welcome and thank you all for being here, and I'm really looking forward to talking about these issues and sharing this day with you and hearing from you all as well. So thank you. Do you have anything to...
Only that Creative Alliance are delighted to be partnering with Laura and Karen because the topic, the subject matter is at the very heart of what we do as a social enterprise, which is enable talent from diverse backgrounds, abilities and experiences getting to work in creative, digital and marketing roles. So it's at the very heart of what we do as an organisation. So I'm delighted to welcome you all here for what I think will be a really thought-provoking afternoon of conversation.
So we're going to start in a minute. For those of you obviously who use social media, all of our hashtags and Twitter handles are on here. And I also want to say thank you because there's quite a few colleagues of mine who I've only seen on Zoom for the last year and a half, and who particularly come from outside the region. So I've got colleagues from Rushmore, from Lancashire, we've got colleagues from Nottingham, Shropshire, and I always appreciate that diversity is such an important, it's a really important thing for those who make the distance and make that journey. So thank you very much. And I'm now delighted to hand over to Sandeep Mahar, MBE, Leadership Associate at the Royal Shakespeare Company and Director of Sector Change at People Make It Work, and Justin Temmen, who is Theatre Director at The Changemaker and also Leadership Associate at the Royal Shakespeare Company. They're going to be interviewing each other, and they're particularly going to be looking at and having a discussion on inclusion and building a culture of belonging so people can do their best work. We're going to go for a conversation about 45 minutes, and then I'll hand over some Q&As with everyone in the audience. Is that okay? Any questions before we start? Can everyone hear us? The room is mic'd apparently, so I think we all knew I did not need a microphone, so that would be scary. Everyone can hear me at the back. Great. So
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for inviting us and sending our warm, positive vibes to Helga Henry. And thank you for inviting us as well. We've got to make sure we don't stray into gossiping, right? Because we have to remember we're having this conversation in front of an audience. So what we're going to do, we thought we would just start by us just sharing some background to our respective roles and our respective journeys to where we are at the RSC. And including how our roles as leadership associates came about, and then some insight to the difference we are making at the RSC, and then we will discuss 3 things that we think other organisations can do to enable greater representation at senior levels and build more inclusive working practices and cultures. So I'm going to start by inviting Justine to share her background and journey. Thank you.
So I did want to start right at the very beginning because there are so many things I think that inform who you become as an adult. And we were really wanting to reflect on what our journeys have been that have led us to place EPJI so centrally to our professional working. So I suppose for me what was really key was that I grew up as mixed heritage in a rural setting, so one of very few faces of colour out in rural Oxfordshire. So I was quite a quiet child, and for me, theatre really helped me to find my voice. And not to underemphasise also privilege, I had 2 extraordinary grandparents, and this is important because I spent a lot of my term and time in learning and community practice. 2 grandparents who had been teachers, and in the school holidays just made our life joy in terms of learning about the world that we lived in without realising that's what we were doing. We weren't sitting and looking at books, we were connecting with the world, whether that was maths, geography. So really extraordinary there, and also a mother who absolutely understood the role of the role that arts can play also in helping us to understand the world. But I didn't really realise I had the opportunities that I'd had until I left school. So having been involved in school plays and being able to speak in front of a room full of people for the first time was a really big thing. And then I discovered that not everybody had those opportunities in school. So when I was studying theatre at Bristol University, I discovered this thing called community theatre. And I thought, wow, this feels like what theatre really needs to be, or what theatre really is. And actually, when I went on to my first job at Dundee Rec Theatre, the associate director that I worked with used to say, community theatre is the thing that is theatre. That other thing over there needs the extra word. That's professional theatre, but community theatre is the real thing. And I do still fundamentally believe that. And also a little nod to 2 feminist lecturers that joined Bristol University in my second year, who just opened up the world for all of the female students, because it was a very white male dominated environment, to understand who we were as young women going out into the world. And an opportunity that I had then to do my dissertation on Black British women playwrights and find narratives that connected with my own. My first job, as I've said, was at Dundee Rec Theatre as a community drama worker, and I sort of see that as an apprenticeship. Scotland has an extraordinary context in terms of community arts, understands intrinsically that that is a central part of what it means to make theatre or to make art, is engaging with communities. So I had 4 extraordinary years of making work by with 4 communities in a way that seems to still be radical when we talk about it now, and that was 20 years ago. And I think the thing that I introduced there was the first work that the theatre had done with newly arrived communities in the city, so particularly South Asian communities. I then had the fortune to spend 6 years living in the Caribbean, where my grandfather had come from, a country called Suriname. I had a really strong sense, because he was a doctor that left Suriname for Europe and gave a lot to this country. This was pre-Windrush, 1930s, 1940s. He was a black doctor in Oldham. And so when I went back to Suriname, I had a really strong sense of giving back to the place that had given him to England. So I ended up spending 6 years there. They call Suriname the mini United Nations. It's the most diverse country in the Caribbean, actually on the mainland of South America, but culturally much more akin to the Caribbean than Latin America. Again, the most extraordinary experience of working with culture where it comes from. So with traditional ritual around mourning ceremonies, circumcision ceremonies, working with Indonesian communities, South Asian communities, Chinese, Creole. Really amazing opportunity to work with culture where it came from, but also look at how we started to make that into performative theatre. One of the things that those cultural groups were often asked to do was to demonstrate their culture to tourists. So that had a sort of income generating aspect to it, a little bit of soft diplomacy, working internationally, but also really exciting opportunities to work with them as artists to create theatre that emerged from those ritual forms. And then in 2003, I came back to the UK and landed up in Coventry as Associate Director for Community, and discovered, because it had been on the hush-hush, some people know that Theatre in Education had been born at the Belgrade, which was the most extraordinary evolution for people that aren't aware of it, of theatre being used in the school environment to encourage children and young people to understand the world that they live in, and to start from where they are at in their thinking, so that you grow from them outwards rather than filling them up with learning from the top down. So that was a really extraordinary thing to reclaim, as it were, as part of our heritage, and that became a very key part of the work that we did at the Belgrade. My drive was very much to diversify the reach of the theatre. Started off through a very diverse reaching community programme. One example was we set up a Black youth theatre to reach the young Black communities of the city, because the representation in our youth theatres was fairly good, but the stories weren't being told. We also set up a writing programme for Black writers, Black and Asian writers, and those two things together, I think, were really the key that evolved the diversity journey for the theatre over a period of 18 years. So slowly that grew into a talent development programme where we started to really offer tailored opportunities for young people coming through our programme, supporting them in their professional development. My namely Ash, who was one of our founder Black Youth Theatre members, in fact, and is now one of our, runs the company that the theatre supports and does extraordinary work with youth groups in the city. So we really started to impact the talent development programme in the theatre, and then also, as exciting work started to emerge, we also started to impact the programme and the diversity of staff more broadly, influencing our City of Culture bid, really emphasising the importance of co-creating work, not just flying in exciting artists from outside and then flying them out again, but really trying to set up an ethos of collaborating with communities to make work. I won't say we're entirely successful, but there were some really great examples of good practice, I think, through that year. And my final year at the Belgrade, I co-curated the theatre's City of Culture programme. So that's my journey through really to the RSC, where Sandy and I both joined in January on a one-year contract as leadership associates to act as critical friends to the senior leadership team at the RSC as they went on a journey to make change in that organisation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in the meantime, Sandy, would you like to tell us more?
Inspired. I'm feeling so inspired by your journey, but also really thinking about those key influences in your life from childhood, but also when you went to Bristol University. And I'm kind of like, oh, I wish I had that. But my kind of influences came later. So I've had a 24-year-long career that started out in libraries in this region. literature, publishing and the arts. And my background is that I was born in Derby, I'm a Midlands girl. I'm the child of working class Punjabi immigrant parents. They couldn't read or write. I had no books in my home. But the one place that my parents allowed me to go to on my own, because they recognised it as a safe space that's open to everyone and has no commercial agenda, was
Library.
the library. Yeah. So that's where I immersed myself in books. And I have to say, that access, that free and democratic access to reading is what really transformed my life. Because there wasn't really a reading culture in my home and in my multicultural community that I grew up in. It was very close-knit, loved my childhood. But I didn't do very well at school. My father had a massive stroke in my teenage years and then became a young carer, and life sort of changed. And it was very disruptive. So I left school with 2 qualifications, and my marriage had been arranged at the age of 19, and I'd had my first child at the age of 21. And when I married and moved to the Black Country, to Warsaw, the first job I got was as a mobile library assistant in Sandwell Libraries. And it was the first job that they'd advertised under their new Positive Action Recruitment Scheme. And there were 2 roles, and they were looking for people who could speak community language skills. And the whole idea with the mobile library was it was taking books for people who couldn't access public library buildings. So imagine taking a mobile library, sheltered accommodation with older people, nursing homes, people who were housebound. And I think what they were really compelled by was my lived experience of being a young carer. Because fundamentally that role was about caring for people who find books that are a lifeline. And I fell accidentally and passionately in love with the work of libraries. So that was my real engagement with community work. And I fell in love with it. I wasn't in a building stood behind a counter. I got a real insight to what people loved reading. And part of my job was about really diversifying who we're serving as well, and to grow the diversity of the workforce. And it kind of started with these 2 roles. So I want to thank Sandwell Libraries for just pioneering a scheme that in that time in 1998, which felt very, very new. So that was very exciting. And I went on a whirlwind journey of progression. So Sandwell, in the days of training budgets, sent me to this university when it was called UCE to do my library degree, and they paid for it. And I did that part-time whilst having another baby. And it's not the way to do it, really not the way to do it. And so it felt amazing that I could have this education that I feel like I didn't quite get. So there was this real strong sense of achievement. My parents were incredibly proud. And yeah, that whirlwind journey of progression led to me entering the publishing industry with 0 connections. Like, I didn't know anybody who worked in publishing. I didn't know any writers. And it was a very white space, as you can probably imagine. And that was, 2007. And I learned how to navigate white spaces while also trying to present some really compelling research that publishers should be collaborating with libraries, because libraries have a reach to an audience that's so diverse, so grassroots, and librarians are really expert, and what's more, the community really trusts them. And so we set up a 2-year pilot program, a skills and knowledge sharing scheme between publishers and libraries, and I acted as the national conduit to those libraries, and it was absolutely phenomenal. Publishers got it, and it's taken us a long time to get there, but things are changing in publishing. And I think you may have even noticed over the last 2 to 3 years, publishing output has really diversified. We've got bestsellers like Bernardine Evaristo, who I know from when she was first starting out, seeing audiences of like 30 in library venues. She packs out town halls and theatres today. That is an extraordinary journey, and it was wonderful for me to be part of that and to be championing that cause. I then did my Claw Fellowship, as people do. You're a Claw Fellow as well. And I often describe that as a form of social engineering that's kind of designed to really challenge your behaviours, to really interrogate your own values, and to lead in a way that is really true to who you are as a person. And it was hard. Because I felt like I was living two quite parallel lives. My the diverse life back here in Warsaw, and then my incredibly creative, sort of glamorous life in the publishing industry in London. Like, I was commuting. It was crazy. And the two never converged. So I really grappled with that, and Claude gave me that opportunity to really think about actually what is it that I really care about? What is my purpose in life? And from there, I took this giant risk and giant leap into leading by leaving the literature, libraries and publishing world, which was the only world I'd ever known at that point, and going to do something very different at a digital commissioning agency called The Space. And setting up the Birmingham office, and I'm looking at Laura because she was very much at the heart of it. It was a battle-hardening experience for me. And I discovered actually my heart is really in literature and developing young talent and building aspirations through greater representation in books, on the screen, on stage. And so for the last 5 years before I landed at the RSC, I was director of Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature, and we were uniquely the only city of literature that centred young people's voices. And that was really about giving young people power and agency in shaping the programme. And Richard Bromwell's here, my incredible producer from Nottingham, who helped deliver it. And it was phenomenal. And Nottingham's a really special place to me. We built something that was really special and important and put young, diverse voices at the heart of building something really special and important. And I think the golden thread in my career has been that passion for place and my belief in the power of literature and stories. Local stories, but also stories of the world, and building aspirations through greater representation. So that really drives me. But also, this is a very personal thing, I'm incredibly driven by the need to exceed the expectations that my culture has of me as a woman and as a South Asian woman. And what comes from that is this real hunger to learn, to grow, to be really curious. And that's just been a common thread. And that's why I'm really interested in supporting people and organisations with change and development, particularly around EDI. Yeah.
It's really lovely to hear. I mean, Sandy and I have been working together for I was going to say 9 years, for 9 months. And I think definitely one of the strengths of the model, which we'll come on to, is that there were two of us entering that change space. But really lovely, there are new things I'm hearing, of course, and there's a real commonality, I think, between what you were saying about those community library spaces and the space that youth theatre can provide for young people to engage with culture, but also their own opinions and the opinions of others. So there's quite a lot of commonality there, isn't there?
Should we talk about these roles?
Do you want to say something about the application process and what that looks like for you?
So the Leadership Associate model is part of the RSC's commitment to diversifying who leads and governs the company, and which is in turn part of a range of measures called Making a Difference. And Making a Difference is like a pan-organisational wide programme, which is about the RSC becoming a more diverse, inclusive, anti-discriminatory, relevant organisation. And so these roles were created within that Making a Difference framework. They're time limited to reflect, I think, the period of really intense reflection and planning that the RSC was entering as they were emerging through the other side of the pandemic, but with a view to committing to real embedded change so that we could influence the decision making through the thinking that we're doing this year. There was a 3-stage process. A very unusual application process, which I'll talk about in a moment. First stage interview and then a second stage interview. And what was really interesting about this process, and I think really compelled me to apply, was of course the brief, to be able to make a difference and to offer critical friendship. But I felt the whole process felt very inclusive. So this wasn't your standard, submit your CV and a supporting statement showing how you meet the criteria. They instead invited candidates to respond to 2 questions, the very strict word limit, something like 250 words. And those two questions were, what experience, perspective, and skills will you bring to shaping the strategic direction of the RSC? And what kind of change do you imagine the RSC is uniquely placed to make in the world?
2,500 characters, I think. We had to
No, it's 1,500 characters.
1,500. It wasn't very much.
Yeah. So actually, it'd be really good just to get a sense of how that process was for you, and maybe a little bit of insight to the vision you share.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I found it very liberating actually, because I love words and I can find lots of words to describe the things that I want to say, and so being made to condense that down felt really useful. I know also that the process that the RSC has really challenged themselves on that process, because it didn't work for everybody. But not to have to go through that thing of covering letter of 3 sides of A4 felt heaven. I mean, I might have written a couple of sides of A4 in order to condense it down, but it just felt really useful just to be able to go bam, 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 and not to have to think about the curation of the word, the shaping of the word, the poetry of the word, just to be able to bullet point it really. And quite empowering to be able to say, yeah, I bring this, and I bring this, and I bring this. So it was for me about my co-creation practice, my combination of my practice as a leader and as an artist, the understanding of running organisations, which I think became quite important to their recruitment actually. I think they were very open at the point of recruiting as to who might come in and how that might work. And I think as they interviewed, they actually found they were drawn to people who did understand how an organisation functions at this particular stage. That might be, because this is a model that they're looking at and continuing over a number of years, that might change. But at this particular stage, with that drive that they had to be different emerging from the pandemic when they were going into it, they felt they needed people that understood how an organisation functioned and how to manage staff and to work with staff and change. But I know for me, the thing that really drew me was that everybody had been saying through the pandemic, we want to be different coming out of it. And then we were coming out of it and thinking, are we going to be different? Are we really going to be different? There are lots of initiatives and things that made things look different, but were they really? But this offer felt very genuine.
And being part of that change. I love the word liberating that you've used, because it did really feel like for me, I could bring my whole authentic self to the process. I didn't need to mold myself into the thing that I think the RSC are looking for. I'm going to present my vision, I'm going to present my perspective, and if they want me, if they really connect with that, great. If not, then that's fine too. And it really did come from a place of confidence, and what I really loved is the idea of working as a duo. And that's something I've become a really big advocate of, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we come to share those 3 things that I think we think other organisations can do, is to think about joint collaborative leadership models. So I didn't know Justine before he landed at the RSC, and it's extraordinary. Like, our partnership is really underpinned by trust and respect and confidence, and we have each other's backs like 100% all of the time. And I'm so glad that you're here, like, doing this for me.
And I think we'd also both want to say that actually, in terms of the openness of the leadership, there was a real, basically they were inviting us in as critical friends to them going through change. And the openness to that, of being challenged, was really, I really take my hats off to the team, because that's not easy to have to be doing things the way you've done them for however many years, and someone going in, oh, why are you doing it like that? Or have you thought about this? And not to be being met with the wall of, oh, that's how we've always done things, but genuine curiosity. Oh, I wouldn't have thought about doing it like that. Why are you thinking about doing it like that? So there was a co-creation between us, but also a real sense of openness and co-creation with the senior leadership team. And also in shaping the roles, because I think nobody really knew quite what we would be doing beyond the very initial task, which was about a strategic review, which wasn't a small task, but sort of how it would all shape. shape up, I think it's sort of been a journey. Which
Shall we talk about the initial steps of co-leading that strategic review process, which was about asking profound questions of the RSC's future as well as the sector's future and their role within that. Do you want to talk us a little bit through that, and then maybe we can share some of the diverse inputs we've had?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were given the questions to ask because that sort of journey had already begun. But we were basically asking people, what do they want the RSC to look like in 10 years' time? So quite a nice big visioning question, and then also thinking about what are the things we're doing well, what are the things that we need to change. And we spoke to a very wide range of people, and I think that's really important in terms of this inclusion narrative, is if you're going to make change, you've got to take the whole organisation with you. That's an organisation, I think, currently of about 500, although previously of about 800, so rebuilding, I suppose, now post-pandemic. So those conversations with the full staff team, not everybody all at once, but we had opportunities to speak with the steering group, which is middle management level. We had open sessions where anybody from the organisation could come and join. We spoke to partner organisations, so we have theatre partners all over the country for when we do our touring work, and our focuses for our education and community work. We spoke to other people in the sector and what their perspectives were on what the RSC should be. We spoke to members of the local community. When we spoke to partners nationally, they were reflecting conversations that they'd had with their communities. So it really was a 360, wasn't it, on what the nation thought the RSC needed to be, which is also a very brave thing to do, to be asking that widely and to be genuinely listening.
And they were very honest. They were challenging. But I think that was the idea, actually, to really help us shape the narrative. And they had some great ideas as well, real specific actions and ambitions for the future. And I feel like it was a great privilege to be part of that, to be encouraged to think very widely and very deeply through those conversations, and to kind of believe that actually through this consultation and the conversations, we can begin to frame a narrative, a kind of core purpose, a vision, and a set of ambitions that are going to guide our future. And that felt very exciting, I think, for me. It was great to spend time with people inside and outside of the company. And it just, for me, I think it gave me a real strong sense of the journey the RSC has been on, and the basket of reasons for why we need to do this, I think, was really important as well.
And I think there's something in the model of the leadership associates in that as well, that we were both inside and outside. So if you like, the SLT sort of fielded us as people that could go and speak to the staff team, and the staff team would feel comfortable saying anything because we were the senior leadership team. So it's been quite an interesting inside-outside journey, hasn't it? And I think, you know, the idea that it's just a 1-year contract and then bringing new people in after that year is also comes from that desire to hear new voices. And what we found is, I think, has been that open phase of sort of knowing nothing, so we could be completely neutral for people that spoke to us. But now, sort of 9 months in, we've got a sense of the organisation and our feet under the table, so we can be doing our last bit of work a little bit more informed by the nature of the organisation that we're in. And actually, also in terms of that flexibility, and I think that's really important when we're thinking about inclusion and diversity, is thinking flexibly and being prepared to change the model. So the context we find ourselves in is that there's new artistic leadership coming in June. And so actually our contracts have been extended, and we have more days a week from this month, partly sort of supporting that transition because it's a bigger transition than might have been expected. So there's a real flexibility in the model.
Yeah. And some of the ambitions expressed was, I mean, the appetite for change is there. and the ambitions expressed very much related to the RSC's role as a global leader in theatre, learning, research, in having a program, an ambitious, diverse, inclusive program, really underpinned by co-creative principles, and an ambition which is around people and empowering people, building safe and inclusive working practices, which is where a lot of our role does intersect. So whilst you've been very much more over on the creative output, and I've been on the organisational development side, it's the change that's really brought us together.
Yeah. And I think what's been really powerful is when we think about change, we might think in an organisation of that size, or that's going to be very difficult. And there are challenges which we'll maybe come to. But having had those conversations right at the very beginning, saying, what do you want? And actually what is really surprising, and I remember experiencing it at the Belgrade as well, when we did some work around institutional marketing, was the terminology then. And everyone was asked, what were the pieces of work that they found that they were most proud of? And this was an organisation where I was leading a community and education programme with the usual frustration of running that kind of work in an organisation where it's always secondary. And actually most of the staff members were saying the work they were most proud of was the work where we were going out into communities or going out into schools. And it was very similar at the RSC, that people want this change. They don't want to be in the same space. We don't want to be in the same space we were 3, 4, 5 years ago. So in hearing what everybody in the organisation was saying they wanted, and saying they were proud of the education work, and saying they were proud of how the organisation made changes in people's lives, it means as we're going back now with areas of work that are encouraging the change around diversity, around more co-creation, and people maybe start to put down barriers because they're thinking, oh, that means we've got to change how we work. We can be saying, but it's what you said you wanted. Not in a blackmailing kind of way, but remember, this is what you said, and we said then it's not going to be easy, but this is what we all want. It's not somebody coming in and telling you. It's we've shaped these values, we've shaped these ambitions emerging from what you've said, and now we're going on a journey together to achieve them. And that's been hugely powerful. Whenever it's hit difficult moments, it's going back to those conversations and saying, we discussed this together. And Sandy, you've been leading quite a lot, I think, on the explicitly on the equalities and diversity work.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a bit about what you've been doing and how that's been received and how you've been managing that?
Yeah, so leading that change has been in a large part of the journey, I guess. Looking back where the RSC has been, where they are now, and facing up to the reality that is the RSC is still not one of the most diverse, inclusive, equitable theatre companies in the world. And that needs to change urgently. So that's the kind of harsh reality. But what I will say about that change is that there is so much optimism, there's energy, there's investment, while recognizing that actually we've got this history, these historical commitments to representation and diversity hasn't always been great. It's sometimes really failed the RSC in making the company a truly inclusive place to work. So there's a context to this change, which actually was kind of hard to grapple with. You've held me at moments. I think we've held each other. Because we've just had to acknowledge that the RSC has played a part in reinforcing structural inequalities. And I think it's important that we unequivocally accept that. Our role in upholding discrimination, systemic barriers to change. So what really compels me is that opportunity to shape the future, to be part of that change program, having grappled with that discomfort, because the RSC is it's a white organisation. There's an embedded whiteness, and I don't mean that in a racialized way. It's more about the power system and who it favours. So, it's taken me a while to grapple with that and to get to a place where we're taking the company on a journey to be able to articulate why this is important, where we're trying to get to, and this is how we're going to get there. And in an environment that feels very supportive and very open, where people feel like they can have conversations in safe, non-judgmental spaces. So we acknowledge that, and I have to say at times it has felt really overwhelming. But I'm really excited and empowered by the promise of leadership, the promises made by leadership to keep an absolute non-negotiable commitment to this work, to keep that unstoppable progress happening. And that, I think, is shared by the senior leadership, totally, very much driven by Erica Wyman, the artistic director, Catherine Mallion, the chief executive, as well as the board. There is that shared commitment to leadership. So it's not just lip service. Our agenda is very much about inspiring action, measuring that impact, and sharing our story of changing cultures and practices. It's not easy to do. It's actually really hard to do. And you've got a pretty good example, actually, some of the work you've been doing around changing culture and practices in rehearsal room spaces. So maybe we can share a couple of examples around how we're doing that.
Yes. So, as Sandy said, I've been working more on the artistic side, and I suppose there are 3 levels to that work. One has been around integration, and I can share a few definitions that we've shaped together in some of our sessions. Integration, by that we've meant a more interdisciplinary way of working, so an internal way of working that means that is more joined up, that respects the skills and expertise of each team, that understands other people's resources, being more porous and collaborative, merging resources and knowledge. If you like, integration is the structure that we need to work in, and an organisation the size of the RSC, the different departments can be quite separate. But my experience of working in other organisations is that can be the case in smaller organisations also. So there's been a real bit of thinking about how we work together in a more joined up way. In particular, thinking about how perhaps the communications or the producing or the production teams integrate their thinking around education, learning, community, placemaking projects, so that they're not secondary, but they're an integral part of the work programme. The second word, if you like, that we've looked at is co-creation, which I'm sure will be a familiar word to most people, particularly in relation to Arts Council strategy, but we wanted to discuss and define what it meant to us. So we've said co-creation is about agency, empowerment and shared ownership with our communities. It's about making work with rather than for people, letting go, being outward facing, the process being as important as the product, integrating diverse cultures and thinking, being accountable, asking what are we making, how are we making it, and who will we making it with and for. So really trying to articulate those 2 terms of integration being more internally focused and co-creation being more externally focused. And the other bit of work that I think sort of sits in between those that I've been doing is, that Sandy referenced, is about the rehearsal room culture. So how do we induct artists into the RSC so that they understand our newly formed and consulted on values? We also consulted with freelancers, I didn't mention that. How do we make the rehearsal space an inclusive space where people feel they can make contribution? If there are issues, how can individuals be supported, in particular learning needs, for example, safe reporting processes if something arises that feels uncomfortable, how do we monitor that through rehearsal period, and how do we evaluate? You'd be surprised that, when I was at the Belgrade, that people make a show, it goes on, creative team will sort of leave it as it's performing, and the process never really gets evaluated. So really looking at those processes of ways of being more inclusive of our creative teams and our acting companies, but also looking at what it means, an integrated process, how that serves those artists coming in, but also how we co-create with those artists. And anybody that it finds themselves in London over the next couple of months, you might be interested in going to see Totoro, which is the RSC's next big family show that is based on My Neighbour Totoro, the Studio Ghibli film, which some of you might know. Really beautiful piece of theatre that's opening next Tuesday, but a really interesting process of co-creation with a 24-strong East Asian creative company, which has been a really exciting process to be supporting and to be around. So there's that, how do we integrate, how do we co-create with our communities, but also how does all of that service the core of our work, which is how we work with our artists to support them to work and service our communities.
Yeah, so there's alongside that work of changing culture and practice, there is the things like the radical, what feels like a radical review of all policies from an EDI lens perspective. There's work around how we're tackling discrimination, how we promote allyship, how we build capacity and confidence of our colleagues so that they feel confident in talking, being an ally, but also taking action as well. So it feels really positive just to be able to bring our roles together and converge across changing practice and culture alongside some of the other work around building capacity, confidence, and reviewing policies. And that feels really important because we do want the RSC to be a place where everyone feels like they belong, where their creativity is encouraged, where they know if there is a problem, particularly around discrimination, they know what they can do and they will be supported. Be it if they witness or experience discrimination, they could be an audience member or an artist. And that feels really important. And for them to feel like, actually, this is a place where I can realise my potential and make a difference. And that making a difference has been a really key, consistent message. So whilst I said at the beginning it feels quite overwhelming and challenging, because of the history, it does feel very positive, the journey that we're on.
And I think that adds to that as well. I'm aware what we haven't spoken about is the fact that the RSC is there to uphold this sort of great bastion of white male artistry. And you had a really interesting way of looking at that, Sandy, because we've been asking the question, why Shakespeare now? Why does the RSC exist? Why is it relevant and resident? And how do we make it relevant and resident? Are you okay saying?
Well, yeah, I've got this view, like, with Shakespeare, like, so much flex and bend. You can fearlessly find new meaning in Shakespeare's work. So when we come to talk about decolonization, I fundamentally believe what we should do is decolonize the journey to Shakespeare. How do we get to Shakespeare? And really interrogate those stages, those phases, those touch points, and really interrogate that. So, I mean, I don't have the answer, but I really want to look at it with other partners.
And I think some of the things we've spoken about are about that. It's how do we have this thing that belongs to all of us and make it feel like it belongs to all of us, and we can take bits of it or leave bits of it as we see fit.
Just we're out of time. How much
Yeah.
time do we have?
We've got 2 minutes, which is kind of
Till 3? Oh, okay. Should we just share our 3 things? Would that be okay? And that might be useful just in terms of some of the, because we want this to feel like a conversation. So the 3 things that we wanted to share with you, just some thoughts about what other organisations could do to think differently about how we move that EDI needle. And recruitment, I mean, this has been a really interesting experience for us to think about those opportunities when recruitment opportunities arise within your organisations, to take the time to think about the job design, to think about how you can make recruitment more inclusive and more accessible. And this has been a bit of a passion for me. I have this other half of my life as Director of Sector Change, supporting boards with being really proactive about succession planning with their leadership, and the opportunity that presents in redesigning their leadership as a way of enabling greater diversity at senior levels. So really taking the time to identify what is the leadership capacity and need for the next 10 years within your organisation. And then thinking about, okay, so what are the skills, behaviours, lived experiences are we going to need? How are we going to find out? Take a really inclusive approach to that consultation, both with your teams, your boards, your trustees, as well as your external stakeholders. Bring that insight in. And also talk to those boards who've been through a process and it's worked really well. I also think about exploring different models. So the leadership associate model I absolutely love because it's a joint collaborative leadership model, but also make sure that it completely aligns with your values and your ethos as an organisation. And fundamentally, that is also about examining the issue of power. So when we're thinking about shared distributed leadership models, I feel like power has always been an issue in diversity and inclusion work. To really examine your power, think about who has power, who doesn't, how you're going to share that. Because I think we've recognised through the work that we've done, people sometimes need more space, more capacity to be able to engage in different ways. And it's okay to step aside and let go of your power and to share it, whilst holding on to, be it artistic integrity or otherwise. Yeah.
I think the third thing we were thinking was around being on receive. People that do come from a theatre background and have had experience in improvisation, we talk about blocking and receiving. So when somebody, if we were improvising and Sandy offers me an idea and I don't like it, I do something different, so that's blocking. Whereas if she offers an idea and I just have to go with it, I'm putting myself in her hands, I'm receiving. And I think that is really fundamental when we're thinking about equality and change. That we've talked a lot in the RSC. One of our values that's been emerging is around bravery, and managers are talking a lot about how they enable their teams to speak up. And I kept thinking, it's not just about enabling them to speak up, it's how you receive their thought and idea, because high chances they'll be saying, why don't you do it like this, when you've been doing it the other way for perhaps all your career, and your immediate feeling is, well, because I know, because I've got 20 years of experience, or whatever the reason is. And it's how do you catch that moment? And I think for me that feels really fundamental. It's the simple thing that if you can't deal with it in the moment, which is all right, because it's painful, it's hard sometimes to hear young innovative voices or older innovative voices challenge you. How do you receive that? Say thank you for that offer. Can I just give it some thought and come back to you? That just buys you the time, that means you don't snap or block or shut down, that means that person never speaks up again in the context of the meeting. So that was our thought about how to be truly inclusive. It's not just about creating the space for people to speak, it's also about how you receive that idea and reflect on it, and then how you move forward with it.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I have also got thousands of questions. I thought actually we were a bit remiss in our introduction. The reason we ran this was for any of you that looks after perhaps a way to feel that I do, and who's putting in the application and talking about inclusivity and relevance. The data doesn't show, it shows negligible change in terms of workforce. How many times do you sit in rooms like this in the cultural sector? If you look around this room and you look at the kind of intersectional diversity in this room today, as a woman of colour in Birmingham, I very rarely get to be in these spaces to see it reflected back at me. So I have to say what you two have been doing is amazing. I think also about what the RSC is doing, because it is perceived, and it is, a very traditional organisation. So my kind of market being, if the RSC are doing it, why is nobody else doing it? Check that one out there. And who's got a question? Can you say your name as well?
Jennifer, I'm on the conference team at VCU. You mentioned that the RSC is not the most diverse theatre group. Could you give me an example of a theatre group that is diverse?
Intermission youth for me.
Yeah, no, good example. I mean, I think that it's a massive issue across theatres, actually. That as you were just saying, that there isn't a lot of diversity in the sector, and certainly not at leadership level, but it is changing. So there are a lot of youth-based theatre companies that are much more diverse than the mainstream. But there's also some really good examples of leadership of colour in some of our regional theatres, so Northern Stage, Liverpool, Belgrade, of course, Liverpool, Everyman and Playhouse, a couple of theatres in London, Battersea Arts Centre, Royal Stratford East. So there is change, but it is It is slow.
Can I just mention though, Jennifer, representation is not enough. Like, you need to think about how are you building an inclusive culture where people of colour, with disabilities, visible and invisible disabilities, feel safe and included. And how, creating an organisation that has a sense of belonging is equally as important as representation.
And the other to add to that, the image over here, so Chris is going to be talking about that later. It's where the progression is, actually, for people that have diverse and marginalised backgrounds, because you can't just stay at the entry level all the time. And if you look at the data, there's very little movement in terms of middle or senior management in terms of diversity, particularly in Birmingham. But we're going to have some more positive stuff. Virginia. Take me, bro.
Everybody, if you can hear me. Thank you to Laura and to my colleagues at the front. Really, I just echo what Laura said. Really representing this space that's right around the world.
Could you just,
What I wanted to say,
sorry, could you just speak a little bit louder?
you're not hearing. Is that a bit better? Thank you. I just wanted to say that following on from that point about representation, which I think is a really important point, is how do we move on from to issues of, say, intersectionality? I know that's a buzzword that's come around, but it also comes back to something one of the earlier kids said about having a feminist in space, a woman in space, and as we know, intersectionality comes rightly from our feminist sisters. I'm thinking of the way in which the culture sector, particularly in my experience, has been organised in an almost colonial way, where it has been white men, and then it's usually white women, and then the tier starts to break down. And I'm just thinking about how we're all in a space like this, how we can learn from each other, but how we can genuinely address some of those structural inequalities so that actually more people are at the table, more spaces, more voices are at the table, and those institutional changes happen. Because as we all know, when that actually happens, that's when new voices, new perspectives, new programs, new policies, all that begins to change. So how do we kind of move away from that colonial moment of white man, then white woman, and then perhaps some of the rest of us? By the way, I worked at the university, and those people troublemaker.
I feel like it requires bravery and humility for leaders to say, do you know what? I would like a different way of thinking and doing. How am I going to do that? I'm going to step aside and allow other voices to come in. We talk about intersectional inclusion at the RSC, and yeah, it does feel like a buzzword, but it's about shifting our own mindsets so that we are thinking more intersectionally and thinking about the needs of so many different people at the RSC, which is incredibly rich in terms of the conversations that come through. And being really open and transparent about that challenge. But I think it will require leaders to say, okay, I don't know this, and to get kind of comfortable with that. But who does know? What are the diverse inputs can we bring in? Who can help us either through their lived experience or particular expertise in this area? So I think there's something about building your own awareness, and then from that awareness, what is the action we're going to do? Introduce.
I think that's really right, and I think for me it also goes back to that sort of co-creation narrative. So I've just come from an initiative, if you like, at the Belgrade, where three of us as artistic leaders of colour co-curated the City of Culture programme for 2021. And in being offered that opportunity, I was told, okay, you need to leave that community and education stuff behind now. You've got an opportunity to be an artistic director. And I think that was done with goodwill, that we're giving you this opportunity to do this thing now, so step up. And I was like, but I don't want to be the artistic director that you are. If you're inviting three of us in to think differently, not just to look differently, one of us black, one of us Asian, one of us mixed heritage, and not just to look like, it's not just the representation thing again, it's to think differently. And for me, the opportunity of that programme was to look at how, when we programme the work, we're programming with inspiration from our communities, from our artists, from what we as leaders see of the city and the world that we live in, And we're curating a programme that operates on across that spectrum of participation, education, talent development, and the most exciting professional work. And I don't believe that those two things, the participation element and artistic excellence, exist in opposition. They can do, because people don't know what they're doing. But there are people who know how to make artistically excellent work that bears witness to and collaborates with the communities that cultural organisations are there to serve. So I think some of it is, goes back to the thing I said at the very end, is preparedness to listen to how we might do something different. Even if it feels terrifying, it feels like, oh my God, we're not going to sell tickets, we're not going to sell tickets. That's the bane of my life as a theatre maker, because we had a really interesting conversation yesterday, actually, in our artistic programming about how marketing information is fed to artistic directors. It's all figures. And actually, there's no inspiration in that. So artistic directors continue to think there's no inspiration from the community. But actually, as artists, we all derive our inspiration from the stories of human beings. So there's an innate connection between the work that we make and the people that we make it by, with, and for. So I think for me, it's a preparedness to hear somebody saying, I want to do it differently, and going, okay, let's look together at how we can make that happen, rather than no, because now it's this, and we need to deliver in this way.
And I also think young people aren't going to hang around waiting for us and say, for us to understand their identity. They really want to understand, how inclusive are you? Do you create a sense of belonging in your organisation? So I feel like we've got to definitely think differently and bring those diverse inputs into things.
Any other questions? Richard? Any other progress?
Hi, I'm Richard from Open Theatre. I completely agree with everything you're saying, but what I'm puzzling over is the hierarchy. Discussing, you talked right at the beginning about community theatres, where it's at, that theatre over there, that's just one narrative of how we go about doing it. So I'm puzzling over how what we're talking about is not going to change structures and the systems that maintain that hierarchy, rather than celebrate a much richer ecology of theatre making in this country. And Aaron from Theatre Festival wrote an article and said recently about how we are too leading in this country about others of theatre. So, with a slight provocation, how do you do that in a building like the RSC, which dictates in the very form that building takes the kind of theatre you can make?
Good question. Leave that one to you.
Well, I hope I answered some of it in what I was saying already, that I think some of it is about how we change those structures, and that is slow, although it does already feel like there is an openness to think about something differently than there was when we first started having those conversations. And I think partly because people were afraid, and money was tight and still is tight, and COVID is still lurking there, and all the other crazy things that are happening in the world at the moment. It's something certainly that I battle with. If you said to me 5 years ago, would I be working at the RSC? I'd have said no. It's not, because it's too much of a bastion of the cultural hegemony. I think it comes down to that. You talking about Erica Wyman as a real driver for this. I think it comes down to the people in those organisations, and they do. If we're consulting with freelancers, for example, people will talk about the RSC, which is this big thing, this big icon, but actually talk about the people in it very differently. So there's maybe something in that is how we separate ourselves from that that icon that is Shakespeare, and start. I think even in doing the small things that we're doing through the education programme, and bringing those things into the centre of the artistic thinking, I hope that would start to break down those structures. Because if you're genuinely co-creating, and if teams other than the learning and placemaking teams are involved in that co-creation, and you therefore need to find different structures for delivering the work, I would hope if that was a long-term journey, that would start to change the framework that we're operating in. And I think to an extent, we got part way there at the Belgrade, but then couldn't push any further because this sort of existing notion that this is what an artistic director does. But we did shift structures in terms of how of a creative team becoming representatives of the education work and of the artist development work and of communities, supporting emerging companies who were delivering to communities that we weren't yet reaching. So in fact, we have Ash, but also Laura Nyahuye, who ran companies that we supported over the City of Culture period, trying to reach new communities and support them and enable them to learn from us, but definitely the other way, learning from smaller companies and companies that were thinking more innovatively than we were. But the problem is there needs to be long-term commitment to that.
And
It changes with the new artistic director.
A different way of doing partnerships, because when I was in Nottingham, often it would feel like these national partners from London are offering something, but actually it's quite a colonial mindset that felt quite oppressive. I'm like, I'm not entering a partnership where there's no equity. Hang on, look at your resources. So I think there is something about disrupting the partnership model that may then, restructure some of the ways of working.
Yeah. I'm just going to add to that, Richard, because it's about workforce. And if you look at Birmingham organisations that we're talking about, so I'm just going to use Birmingham as an example, most of whom are not in this room, they don't have a diverse senior management or a diverse leadership. In fact, all the people that have are pretty much in this room or have said media apologies. So I'm very open about that in Birmingham because we have a non-white majority city and none of that is reflected. And that's before we get on sectionally around. I mean, the big issue in Birmingham is class, which is a whole other conference on another time. but that comes back to, it speaks to your point about colonialism. So I think if we own up, what I really think is important that the RSC have done it is people will expect it's a building with lots of money. It's about people changing. And I'm wearing this for a reason, because it's about power. And lots of people do not want to get rid of their power. The best way to have power is to give it away. And the best thing about being in this sector is about creativity and diversity and plurality. And I still don't think we've got to a certain stage and people are like, oh, no, not really. I want my squares on Instagram and I want to have an inclusivity and relevance principle in my MPO application. But putting people in senior management, no, we've got to wait a while before that.
And it's how that leadership and management happens throughout the organisation. But wherever anybody sits, if you can operate in a way that's about sharing power with your colleagues, trusting to their expertise in their particular areas of work, that starts to empower people across the organisation and filter up. One more question? This might be on us. Unless you don't want a coffee break, we squeeze the coffee break with one more question.
This is working?
Yeah.
I'm Rachel. Thank you for your generous stories this afternoon. I wanted to know a bit more about your engagement with the board and the trustee interview experience too. That makes sense for all the questions and the positions that I'm really interested to know.
Well, it's fully integrated. We are fully integrated as part of the senior leadership team. And the senior leadership team have a direct link to the board. We are represented at the board meetings, so we go along. But you've had your own journey with the board.
Yes, I mean, I actually started with the RSC on the board because they were recruiting with this change agenda. And I thought, okay, if that's the direction you're going in, I think I've got something to offer there. But also my personal circumstances changed. These jobs came up and I thought, I feel like I can make that change from the inside. That feels like exactly my area, the idea of around the integration and co-creation. So I stepped back from the board to do the role for a year. And the fact that my roles have been extended means that I now step down from the board because they can't hold my face over for more than a year. And I find, I mean, it's interesting because I feel a little bit, I think one of the challenges that boards have is that they need to have distance from the organisation, but also they need to understand the organisation. And if I can speak more generally about boards in the sector, I think there's not enough understanding of cultural organisations and what they need to run. And there's also not enough understanding of evolution in practice. So maybe a lot of people join boards later in their lives when they maybe have a bit more spare time or are more financially stable, and to maybe hold an idea of what theatre is, and just using theatre as an example, from their own youth, and so feel a responsibility to hold on to that, because it's important, right? It's important for them, it's important for others. And I think there's a lot of nuance. I can talk to people about participatory practice, and when it comes down to actually delivering that, I'm thinking, whoa, I don't agree with how that's being delivered, because it's not really about hearing voices, it's about having those people in the room, it's about representation, but it's not really about inclusion. So there's a whole nuance and expertise that, Richard, who just asked the question, to say one of the people that really holds that expertise in the room and understands what that is, that isn't held on boards. So there's a lot of support, for example, for education work and for community work, because people on boards are generally good people, and they know that that is good work and supports children, young people, and disadvantaged communities. But I would say there's much more a perspective of corporate social responsibility there than genuinely thinking about how can we recreate what Richard is saying, reimagine our cultural organisations so that they genuinely are in service to all of our communities, not just those that can afford to pay for it. So I've sort of moved away from the RSC board specifically there, but I think that's a general challenge for the sector across the country, is that there's not enough nuanced understanding of ways that we can think differently about diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. We've got one last question, Ed.
Oh, hi, Ed Matthews-Gentle, strategic lead for culture and trade ministries at Lancashire County Council. You both spoke about how you need to be true and true to your convictions in terms of what you both want to do now, in terms of things that are important to you, and the importance of things like the flow program, informing that. But you also spoke as well, in a very open and honest way, about the challenges that you encountered at RSC in terms of maybe some pushback and some questions and resisting to some ideas. So I was just curious to understand a bit more about what was it that you felt was authentic about your will and intent. Was there something specific that kind of signaled that to you, or is it about something else?
Are you asking what was authentic about the will that was signalled from the organisation as a whole?
Yes.
Yeah, so I didn't really have any relationships with the RSC in the way that Justine did, because she'd been on the board. I felt like an outsider. I don't have a theatre background. So I felt like I was coming really cold to this process. But I was so energised and excited by the leadership and by Erica Wyman and her vision. She absolutely gets it. She drives this work. So for me, there was something about her commitment, her vision, and then really understanding the process, that they were really open to this co-creation process and not really knowing at the beginning of a process what this leadership associate role might look like. We get an opportunity to shape that. And that's what I really loved about it. So they were really open and really flexible to how that could be done. They didn't really have a set fixed idea. And they were very flexible and responsive to my own personal changing circumstances. So I'm a carer now, to an elderly mother-in-law. I want a different way of working. Partly the reason why I had to quit a big job in Nottingham, so I could work in a different way. So there was personal, but also really compelled by Erica and the senior leadership team by that. I mean, you were on the inside, so you have a different view.
Well, I suppose that first signal for change had been around recruiting to the board. So I think they recruited 5 new members to the board when I was recruited. And there was an active decision to not recruit single voices, So when they recruited 5 new people, we were all of colour, all with a disability, all women. So that there was a bit of a critical mass of that alternative voice, and that felt important because it can be very difficult being the lone voice on a group, especially when you're joining a board like the RSC's board. So that felt already a signal. And I think also, as I said, I'd worked very closely on the City of Culture and sort of shaping that vision for a co-creation model. And Erica also sat on the trustees group in City of Culture with a real, the RSC has been involved in Cities of Culture before, it did something up in Hull, but there was a real indication of commitment to the area because, of course, Coventry was different because Stratford's half an hour down the road. So this is that was their local city. So there was a real commitment to place and region, which is quite, felt quite innovative. So on top of the things that Sandy was saying, those things made a difference also.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Go wildly, like so nothing changes, we've gone overtime as so what I would suggest, we do need a break, a break. Everyone knows where the toilets are, we've got tea and coffee in the other room, so what I would suggest is have a 5-minute break and bring your drinks back in here, is that okay?